He didn't even look at her when he said it. Adrian Vescari stood at the head of his dining table, 20 feet of polished obsidian, surrounded by men who flinched when he breathed too hard. And he pointed one finger at the woman standing near the doorway, like she was a stain someone had tracked in off the street. "Who let the cleaning girl into my house?" Eliza Rowan didn't move. She held the handles of her canvas bag with both hands, her knuckles white beneath her skin, and she kept her face exactly the way she'd learned to keep it over 37 years of life, kicking her in places that didn't show. Completely, deliberately blank. "She's the caregiver, Mr. Vescari." His house manager, a thin man named Colton, spoke from somewhere behind her left shoulder. "The agency sent her. For your mother." "I can see she's breathing." Adrian finally looked at her then, the way a person looks at furniture they're considering returning. His eyes moved from her worn flats to her department store blouse to her face, and something in his expression didn't sharpen so much as flatten, like whatever he saw wasn't worth the energy of a real reaction. "I'm asking who approved this. Because whoever looked at her and decided she was qualified to be inside my family's home made a serious error in judgment." The men at the table didn't laugh. They were smarter than that. But two of them looked away, and that was almost worse. Eliza had been dismissed before. She'd been talked over, talked around, talked about like she wasn't standing right there. 14 years in care work did that to a person. Ground away the sharp edges, taught you that making yourself smaller was sometimes the only way to stay in the room long enough to do your job. She knew how to absorb things. She'd had a lot of practice. "Eliza Rowan," she said, because she'd learned that much. "Say your name, make it real. Don't let them reduce you to a pronoun." "I've been a certified caregiver for 11 years. I have references from 4 families. The agency can send the full file if you'd like." Adrian Vescari looked at her for exactly 2 seconds after she finished speaking. Then he turned back to his table. "Get her out of the main rooms. She stays in my mother's wing. She doesn't wander. She doesn't touch anything she wasn't brought here to touch." A pause, like an afterthought. "And tell the agency not to send me nobodies. My mother deserves better than whatever this is." Colton's hand appeared gently at her elbow, guiding her away from the dining room and down a corridor that branched off to the left. And Eliza let herself be guided because the alternative was standing there and letting Adrian Vescari see that his words had landed somewhere tender. She wouldn't give him that. She never gave anyone that. If you've ever watched someone work a room full of powerful, dangerous people and realized the most dangerous person in it was the one everyone had stopped watching, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button before you go any further. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every comment tells me you're still here, and I write every one of these for the people who stay until the end. Vivian Vescari was not what Eliza expected. She'd dealt with enough wealthy, elderly clients to know the archetypes. The imperious dowager who treated caregivers like servants, the sweet-tempered grandmother who was secretly furious about losing her independence, the foggy and confused woman who needed a firm hand and endless patience. She had her own internal triage system by now, a way of walking into a room and reading the signs in the first 30 seconds. The set of the shoulders, the angle of the jaw, the way a person held a book they hadn't been reading. Vivian was sitting in a chair near a window that looked out over the north garden, and she was doing something that stopped Eliza in the doorway for half a beat. She was laughing. Not performing laughter for someone's benefit, not the polished social variety. She was reading something on a tablet propped on her knee and actually laughing, the kind that showed her teeth and crinkled the corners of her eyes so deeply that for a moment she looked nothing like a woman in her late 70s with a heart condition and a son who ran one of the most powerful organized crime operations in the Midwest. She looked like somebody's grandmother, the real kind. Then she looked up and saw Eliza, and the laugh didn't disappear so much as it softened into something warmer. "You must be the new one," Vivian said. Her voice had a slight rasp to it, cigarettes from decades ago leaving their calling card even now. "Come in. Don't hover in the door. That's what the nervous ones do, and you don't look nervous to me." "I'm not," Eliza said, and it wasn't entirely a lie. She crossed the room and set her bag down near the chair positioned across from Vivian's, then offered her hand. "Eliza Rowan." Vivian shook it without ceremony. Her grip was dry and direct. "Vivian, not Mrs. Vescari. I've been Mrs. Vescari for 51 years, and it still sounds like someone's about to hand me a legal document." She looked at Eliza's face the way perceptive old women often did, steady and unhurried and slightly too accurate. "My son was rude to you." It wasn't a question. "He was direct," Eliza said. Vivian made a short sound through her nose. "Don't be diplomatic on my account. I raised him. I know exactly what direct looks like, and I know what rude looks like, and I know which one Adrian defaults to when he's decided someone doesn't matter yet." She picked up her tablet, set it face down on the side table. "He's been wrong before. He'll be wrong again. I stopped taking it personally 30 years ago, and I suggest you do the same." Eliza sat down. "How long has the agency been sending people?" 4 months. I've had 6 caregivers." A slight pause. 3 left because of Adrian. 2 weren't actually qualified. 1, Vivian tilted her head, something moving across her expression that was harder to read. 1 I had to let go for reasons that weren't about her competence." "I see." "Do you?" The old woman was watching her carefully now. "You're not going to ask?" "Not my business yet," Eliza said. "I'm here for your health. Whatever else happened before I got here isn't my job to investigate." Something shifted in Vivian's face. Not a smile exactly, more like a small recalibration, the kind people did when someone surprised them in a way they hadn't expected and needed a moment to account for it. "All right," Vivian said. "Then let's start with the health." She extended her arm, an invitation, and Eliza reached into her bag for the blood pressure cuff. They spent the first 40 minutes in a comfortable working quiet that Eliza had spent years learning to construct. Efficient without being clinical, attentive without being hovering. She checked Vivian's blood pressure, elevated but consistent with the chart the agency had sent, reviewed her medication schedule, noted the one prescription that looked like it might need a follow-up conversation with the cardiologist, and asked questions that were pointed and practical rather than the soft, patronizing variety that older clients had learned to recognize and resent. Vivian answered everything directly. She was sharp. The heart condition had slowed her body, not her mind, and Eliza filed that away immediately because it mattered. Competent. Aware clients were always easier to protect and always more likely to tell you when something was wrong before it became a crisis. "You've done this a long time," Vivian said, near the end of their first hour. 11 years. "You're good at it." "I try to be." "That's not the same thing." Vivian's eyes were still steady on her. "Some people try and still make you feel like a job. You don't." Eliza didn't answer that one. She made a note in the chart she'd started and didn't look up, because there was a version of that compliment that could make her eyes sting if she wasn't careful, and she'd used up her personal allowance for vulnerability a long time ago. The text from Mason came at 7:14 that evening, while Eliza was sitting in the small staff room off Vivian's wing, eating a sandwich she'd packed that morning and trying not to think about the $4,200 balance due at Clearwater Recovery by the end of the month. How was the first day? She stared at her phone for a moment, at her brother's name at the top of the screen, and something in her chest did that familiar complicated thing it always did. The mix of love and grief and obligation that she'd long since stopped trying to untangle because the threads had grown too intertwined to separate cleanly. "Fine," she typed. "Good placement. Nice client." The 3 dots appeared immediately. Mason had gotten better at using his phone again over the last 8 months. A small concrete marker of progress that she measured carefully, the way she measured all of it. "Did you eat?" "Eating now." "Real food or gas station food?" She looked at the sandwich. Turkey and Swiss on wheat, made at 6 a.m. in her studio apartment kitchen, with the window cracked because the exhaust fan had been broken for 3 months, and her landlord had stopped returning her calls. "Real food," she typed. "Good." A pause. Then, "I'm doing better, Liz. I know you worry." She set the phone face down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way she'd taught herself to breathe when the tightness in her chest got bad enough that it started affecting her concentration. Mason was 29 years old. He'd been in and out of addiction treatment since he was 22, a spiral that had started after their mother's death, and that Eliza had spent 7 years trying to arrest by sheer force of will and personal solvency. She'd given up her nursing program. She'd moved into the studio apartment. She'd taken every care placement the agency offered, including the ones in neighborhoods that made her grip her keys differently when she walked to the bus, including the difficult clients, the night shifts, the holiday call-outs. She'd done it without resentment, mostly. Or she'd done it with resentment and learned to put it somewhere where it didn't corrode the work. Mason was all she had left of what her family had been before the bottom dropped out. She wasn't going to lose him because of money. She wasn't going to lose him at all. She turned the phone back over and typed, "I know you are. Get some sleep." Then she finished her sandwich, checked on Vivian one last time, sleeping, vitals good, the soft wheeze of her CPAP machine a steady rhythm in the darkened room, and let herself out of the house through the staff entrance. The night air hit her face, and she stood for a moment on the service path, looking up at a sky that was the deep amber gray of light pollution, clouds sitting low over the city, and she thought about Adrian Viscari pointing at her like something he wanted removed. Whatever this is. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. She would work this placement until it paid what she needed it to pay, and she would be professional and competent and invisible. And eventually Adrian Viscari would stop noticing she existed, and that would be exactly what she needed. She started walking toward the gate. She was very good at being invisible. She'd been practicing her whole life. 3 weeks passed. The rhythm of the Viscari household was something Eliza mapped carefully in the first days. Not because she was curious about the business that ran through it, and she wasn't, or not more than the surface-level awareness that allowed her to navigate the space safely. She mapped it the way she mapped every placement: who was where when, which rooms went quiet at which hours, who the real decision-makers were beneath the official hierarchy of the household staff. Colton ran the day-to-day with the tightly wound efficiency of a man who'd learned to preempt problems before they materialized. He was not unkind to Eliza, but he was professional to the point of impersonality, and she respected that. She was professional to the point of impersonality right back. Vivian's medical team consisted of a cardiologist named Dr. Farrow, who visited twice weekly, and a rotating pool of nursing staff who handled her overnight monitoring. Eliza's hours were days and early evenings, 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., 6 days a week, with the 7th day covered by the agency's backup caregiver, a quiet woman named Phyllis, who Eliza had briefed thoroughly in their one overlapping shift and who she trusted to follow the protocols. Adrian Viscari moved through his own house like weather, unpredictable in his arrival times, preceded always by a shift in the staff's collective posture, the way people in a room rearranged themselves without quite knowing they were doing it. He held meetings in the study, in the dining room, sometimes in the courtyard, when the late September air was still warm enough to make it possible. Men came and went. Conversations dropped to inaudible registers whenever Eliza was in adjacent rooms. She wasn't listening. She genuinely wasn't. She had enough to manage. But she noticed things. She'd always noticed things. It was what made her good at the work. The small deviations that most people filtered out as noise. And what she noticed about Adrian Viscari in the weeks before he noticed her back was this. He was afraid. Not in any way that showed on the surface. The surface was all controlled precision, the measured stride, the level voice, the stillness he wore like armor. But she caught it in the margins, the way he always checked the main entrance before he sat down in any room that had sightlines to it, the way his hand moved, briefly and without apparent thought, toward his jacket whenever a phone buzzed unexpectedly in someone else's pocket, the way he looked at his mother. That last one was the most telling. Most of the men who came through this house wore expressions that were carefully professional in Vivian's presence, respectful, distant, practiced. Adrian looked at his mother the way people looked at the one thing they couldn't afford to lose. It was an expression she recognized. She'd worn it herself for most of her adult life, usually while looking at Mason. It didn't make her like him. What he'd said to her in that first meeting still lived in the particular filing cabinet in her mind, where she kept the things that had hurt her that she wasn't yet ready to put down. She'd experienced enough real contempt in her life to know the difference between someone who was performing dismissiveness and someone who actually, genuinely believed she was beneath his notice. Adrian Viscari had believed it. She hadn't forgiven it. She'd just set it aside the way you set aside anything that might interfere with the work. What? The moment she started to think this placement might be different happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks in, when Vivian asked her if she'd ever wanted anything different. They were in the sitting room. Vivian had been having a good run of days, her stamina up, her mood better than the chart suggested was typical. And Vivian had been asking the kind of questions she'd started asking in their second week together, The probing, lateral variety that Eliza suspected was this woman's primary entertainment now that her range of motion had reduced. Different how? Eliza asked. Different from this. Vivian gestured, a small sweep that seemed to encompass not just the room, but the whole arrangement, the job, the placement, the caregiving itself. You're smart. Anyone spending 10 minutes with you can see that. I'm asking if this is what you chose or what you ended up with. Eliza considered several answers, rejected the deflective ones. She'd learned that Vivian saw through deflection with an accuracy that was faintly alarming, and went with the truth, the abbreviated version. I was going to be a nurse, she said. I was 2 years into the program when my mother died and I had a younger brother who needed somebody. The caregiving paid and it was flexible and I was already trained for the adjacent work. A pause. It wasn't a hard choice. It was just the only one that made sense at the time. And now, Vivian said, is it still the only one? Eliza looked at her. I'm 37. The program I was in doesn't accept credits that old. I'd have to start over from the beginning, and I can't. She stopped, edited. The timing isn't right. Vivian was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that slightly too accurate expression. Your brother, she said. He's the one in the rehabilitation center. Eliza went still. She had not told Vivian about Mason. She'd been careful about that, methodically careful, the way she was careful about everything that could be used as a pressure point. Colton keeps files on agency placements, Vivian said, gently, before Eliza could ask. I asked him to show me yours, not because I was looking for something to use, because I wanted to know who I was letting take care of me. A pause. I have that right. It's my life. Yes, Eliza said after a moment. It is. His name is Mason. Yes. He's been at Clearwater for 8 months. Yes. And you're paying for it. Not a question. Eliza put down the blood pressure cuff she'd been holding. She placed it on the table very carefully and looked at the window rather than at Vivian because the window was easier right now. He's my brother, she said. He doesn't have anyone else. That's the whole answer. The silence that followed was the particular kind that Eliza associated with being seen. Uncomfortable, textured, too large to fill. She'd spent a long time making herself difficult to see clearly. It was disorienting when someone managed it anyway. Well, Vivian said, after a long moment. Her voice was softer than usual. He's lucky then, even if he doesn't know it yet. Eliza didn't answer. She picked up the cuff again and went back to the chart, and Vivian let her, which was its own kind of mercy. It was a Thursday evening, 4 weeks after she started, when Eliza first heard them talking about the route. She hadn't intended to. She'd been in the corridor outside Vivian's sitting room, gathering the medical bag she'd left near the door before dinner, when the voices drifted out through the study's half-open door. She would have kept walking. She'd kept walking past dozens of conversations in this house, except that she heard Vivian's name and the word convoy, and something in the combination snagged at her. She stopped. She knew she should keep walking. She kept listening instead. 2 voices she didn't fully recognize, low and even, the cadence of men accustomed to talking around topics rather than directly at them. A third voice she did recognize, Declan, Adrian's head of security, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s who she'd seen twice before and who moved through the house with the particular economy of someone who'd done a long stretch in the military before pivoting to private work. The estate's secure, Declan was saying. Moving her is the variable. The route hasn't changed in 6 months, the second voice said. Then the route should change, Declan said. It's basic protocol. Adrian approved this route. Adrian approves a lot of things I'd do differently. A pause. The kind that held weight. We move her Thursday. Full convoy. The cardiologist confirmed the check-in at the Lakeside facility is non-negotiable. Then Thursday it is. I want the route details to 3 people maximum. Declan's voice had dropped a fraction. 3. You hear me? Not the full team. 3. The other 2 voices agreed and the conversation shifted and Eliza moved quietly and quickly back toward Vivian's room and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the old woman asleep in her chair with the evening light falling across the gray of her hair. She thought about what she'd heard. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned over the small inconsistencies she noticed in a client's health data. Not alarmed yet, just noting, filing, 3 people maximum. That was Declan's order, standard operational security for a high-value transport. She'd read enough news about this family over the years to understand what that meant. What she couldn't explain yet was the other thing she'd noticed. The fact that the route Declan had called unchanged, the one that apparently Adrian himself had approved, was the same route she'd seen mapped on a document that had been left, briefly and carelessly, on the kitchen table 2 days ago by a man named Harrow, a logistics coordinator. Someone who was, as far as Eliza understood the hierarchy, not one of the 3. She filed that too. She didn't know yet what it meant, but she had a feeling that by Thursday, she would. The city pressed against the windows, lit and indifferent, and Eliza Rowan stood at the edge of something she couldn't yet name and breathed slowly and waited for the shape of it to clarify. She'd learned to be patient. She'd learned a lot of things in 37 years of surviving. Patience was the one that had saved her most often. Thursday came in cold and gray, the kind of Chicago morning that pressed down on everything like a hand flat against the chest. Eliza arrived at the estate at 7:40, 20 minutes ahead of schedule, which was a habit she'd never broken because her mother had drilled it into her early. Early is on time is late. Late is an apology nobody wants to hear. She signed in at the staff entrance, nodded to the overnight guard whose name she'd learned was Petrick, and made her way to Vivian's wing with her bag on her shoulder and the thing she'd been carrying since Tuesday sitting quiet and heavy at the back of her mind. Harrow, the logistics coordinator. The document left on the kitchen table. She'd turned it over 400 times since then, and she kept landing in the same place. It might be nothing. Sloppy procedure, a moment of carelessness from a man who handled too much paper. She'd seen worse operational hygiene in corporate households, let alone ones where the left hand didn't always know what the right hand was doing. But Declan had said 3 people. 3. And Harrow wasn't one of them. Vivian was awake already, sitting up in bed with the tablet on her knee and a cup of tea on the nightstand that had gone cold, which meant she'd forgotten it again, which happened on the harder mornings when her body was stiff and her focus drifted. Eliza checked the tea temperature without comment, set it aside, and started the morning assessment with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that routine was its own form of reassurance. "You're quieter than usual," Vivian said, extending her arm for the blood pressure cuff. "It's early." "You're always quiet. This is a different quiet." The old woman was watching her with that steady, calibrated attention she never seemed to shut off. "Something's bothering you." "I'm fine." "You said that in a tone that means you're not." Eliza secured the cuff, pressed the button, waited for the reading. 142/88, higher than yesterday. She noted it without reacting visibly because Vivian would read the reaction, and they'd spend 10 minutes discussing it instead of addressing it. "We should talk about today's transfer," Eliza said. "The convoy to Lakeside." Vivian said it without inflection, the way people stated facts they'd long since made peace with. "Dr. Farrow says the cardiac monitoring equipment there is better than what we have here. He's probably right." "When are we leaving?" Adrian said 11. A pause. "You sound like you have a question about that." Eliza pulled the cuff free, made her notation, and looked directly at Vivian. In the months she'd worked here, she'd learned that the old woman responded better to directness than to the gentle, cushioned approaches that some caregivers defaulted to. Vivian saw through cushioning the way she saw through everything else, and it wasted both of their time. "The route to Lakeside," Eliza said. "Do you know which way they're taking you?" Vivian frowned, very slightly. "I don't generally involve myself in the logistics. I'd like to know the route." "Why?" Eliza held the question for a beat. The honest answer was complicated and probably sounded paranoid, and was entirely possible she'd misread. But the honest answer was the one she had. "Because I overheard something Tuesday evening that I've been thinking about since," she said. "And I might be wrong. I'm probably wrong. But the route matters to me." Vivian looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that did not rush itself. Then she picked up her cold tea, looked at it, set it down again. "Talk to Declan," she said. "Tell him Vivian sent you." Declan was in the security office off the main corridor, a room that smelled like coffee and old electronics, and that housed more monitors than seemed reasonable for a private residence. He was a man who gave the impression of permanent readiness. The kind of person who'd been in enough situations where a second's delay meant something irreversible that his body had simply stopped knowing how to be fully at rest. He looked up when Eliza knocked on the open door, and his expression was the particular neutral that security professionals wore when they were assessing something they hadn't yet categorized. "Mrs. Vescari's caregiver," he said, "Eliza Rowan." She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, because waiting to be invited would cost her a posture of confidence she couldn't afford to lose. "I want to talk to you about today's convoy." "The convoy is handled." "I know. I want to talk to you about the route." Something moved in his face. Not alarm, not quite. More like attention sharpening at an angle he hadn't anticipated. "What about it?" "There's a logistics coordinator on staff named Harrow," Eliza said. "Tuesday morning, there was a document on the kitchen table. I saw it for approximately 30 seconds before someone collected it. It outlined a transport route for a high-value medical conveyance with 3 waypoints: the underpass at Kellner, the bridge at Route 41, and the service entrance at Lakeside. Declan had gone very still. "That's the route you're using today?" Eliza said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read and said quietly, "How long have you been in this business?" "Caregiving, 11 years. "That's not the business I'm asking about. I'm not in any other business." She held his gaze. "I'm in the business of keeping Vivian Viscari safe. That's what the agency contracted me for, and that's what I intend to do. I'm telling you that a man who wasn't supposed to know your route apparently knew it 2 days ago." The silence in the room was the particular heavy variety that meant the person across from you was recalibrating. "Harrow's been on staff 4 months, Declan said finally. I know that's not conclusive. I know I could be wrong about what I saw." Eliza kept her voice level, kept her hands still at her sides. "But you said 3 people. I heard you say it, and Harrow's not 3 people. Declan stared at her. Then he picked up the radio on his desk, brought it to his mouth, and said, "Find Harrow. Put him in the East Conference Room. Nobody talks to him until I get there." A crackle. A voice confirming. He set the radio down and looked at Eliza with an expression that had shifted into something that was still not warm, but was considerably more focused than neutral. "You're going to tell me exactly what you saw," he said. "Sit down." She told him everything. The document's layout, the waypoints, the timing column, the signature field that had been partially obscured, the date stamp at the top that corresponded to the convoy schedule, the fact that Harrow had collected it without hurrying, without the specific guilty speed of someone who'd realized they'd made an error, which meant he might not have known he was making one. Declan listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both about specifics she'd noticed. The color of the document's header, whether the signature field had had a name or just a blank, and she answered both accurately. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have a good eye," he said. "I notice things," Eliza said. "It's not special, it's just habit. Most people don't notice things that aren't their job. Vivian is my job. Anything that touches her safety is my job." He nodded, once, like he was settling something internally. Then he stood up and said, "The route is changing. We leave at 11, but the waypoints are different. I'll need you ready. Same as planned, same positioning in the second vehicle." "All right." "And Rowan." He said her name without apparent effort, which meant he'd been paying more attention than she'd realized. "If anyone asks you what you told me, don't. Not until I've finished with Harrow." "Understood." She walked out of the security office and down the corridor toward Vivian's wing, and she felt the particular adrenaline aftermath she'd learned to recognize. The shaky edges at the back of her knees, the way her pulse was slightly faster than it should be for a woman who'd just been sitting in a chair talking. She pressed her back against the corridor wall for 2 seconds and breathed, hard and deliberate, then pushed off and kept walking. She didn't know if she'd done the right thing. She didn't know if she'd misread the whole situation, and Declan was about to put Harrow in a room for nothing, which would create an enemy she didn't need in a household she still had to navigate. She didn't know if the route change would create its own problems, disrupted logistics, different timing windows, the variables that multiplied when you altered a plan at the last hour. She knew one thing. She'd seen the document. She'd heard Declan say 3, and staying quiet had never, in her life, made anything safer. Harrow's face, when she passed the East Conference Room 40 minutes later, told her enough. She wasn't supposed to see inside, the door was nearly closed, just a 3-inch gap. But she was moving past at the wrong angle, and she caught a slice of the room. Declan standing with his arms crossed. The expression on his face, the kind that didn't need volume to be threatening. 2 of his men bracketing the table. And Harrow, seated, his hands flat on the table surface with the specific stillness of someone who'd been told not to move them. His face the gray-white color of a person who understood that the game had changed and they were no longer winning it. She kept walking. She didn't feel satisfied. She felt the way she always felt when a calculation turned out to be right. Not triumphant, just quietly exhausted, the way you felt when you'd been carrying a weight for 3 days and were finally allowed to set it down. The weight, she realized, hadn't entirely gone. It had just shifted. Vivienne was dressed and ready by 10:15, which was 15 minutes ahead of the schedule that Adrian had given and 45 minutes ahead of the schedule she actually believed in, because Vivienne Vescari had been getting ready earlier than anyone else for 78 years and had no intention of stopping now. She was sitting in the high-backed chair near the window, wearing a deep burgundy cardigan over a cream blouse, her silver hair pinned back with the precision that told Eliza she'd done it herself this morning, rather than asking for help. Another marker of a good day. The overnight oxygen monitor was already disconnected. The travel medication case was packed and on the small table, every pill in its correct compartment, the labels facing outward, because Vivienne had watched Eliza sort medications twice and had absorbed the system with the exactitude of someone who'd run organizations before age had made that harder. "You talked to Declan," Vivienne said when Eliza came in. "Yes." "Is there a problem?" "Declan is handling it." Eliza picked up the travel case, checked it without really checking it. She knew it was right, she'd checked it twice already, and set it back down. "The convoy is still on schedule." Vivienne studied her. "You're not going to tell me what it is?" "When I know more, I'll tell you what I can." A pause. "You should know that I take this seriously. Your safety, the specifics of it. It's not something I treat as someone else's problem." The old woman was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the estate grounds were the flat gray of an overcast October, the trees stripped down to their structural bones, the kind of landscape that was almost beautiful in its austerity. "You know," Vivienne said, "when Adrian insisted on hiring a caregiver from an outside agency, I thought it was a terrible idea. I told him so. I said I wanted someone I already trusted, and he said the people I already trusted were the problem." A small pause. "He was right. He's irritating about being right." Eliza almost smiled. Not quite. "He doesn't know how to treat people who aren't a threat or an asset," Vivienne continued. "He learned it from his father, and his father learned it from his. It's a family tradition of shortcomings." She looked at Eliza directly. "What he said to you the first day, that was wrong. I want you to know I told him so." "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to. That's not why I did it." Eliza looked at the window. The gray outside was the kind that suggested rain by afternoon, which would affect traffic, which would affect their timing. She filed that. "He didn't apologize," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Vivienne said. "He doesn't apologize well, but he heard me. He hears things more than he shows." A slight smile, tired and knowing. "You'll figure that out." Eliza didn't answer. She picked up her bag and checked the time and said, "We should get you to the vehicle staging area. Declan will want everyone in position by 10:50. "All right." Vivienne began to stand, and Eliza was there, not hovering, not rushing, just present, her hand at the older woman's elbow in the particular way that provided support without announcing it. "Eliza." "Yes." "Whatever happened this morning, thank you." Eliza didn't ask how she knew. She just nodded, and they walked toward the door. The convoy was 3 vehicles. A lead SUV with 2 of Declan's men, an armored midsize in the center where Vivienne and Eliza and a 3rd security officer rode, and a trailing SUV that held 2 more. Standard configuration. The armored vehicle was not comfortable. The additional plating in the doors made the ride stiffer, the windows thicker in a way that altered the quality of light, and the interior smelled faintly of industrial cleaning solution and old leather. Vivienne had ridden in armored vehicles before. She settled into her seat with the particular resignation of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by precautions that reminded her of the exact things she was trying not to think about. Eliza sat across from her, the travel case on the seat beside her, her bag on the floor between her feet. The security officer in their vehicle, a younger man named Torres, early 30s, square-jawed and quiet, in the way of someone who concentrated rather than someone who had nothing to say, was positioned near the rear door. They were 10 minutes out of the estate when Eliza noticed the first thing. The route was different. Declan had changed it, as he'd said he would. They'd gone north on Caldwell instead of taking the Kellner underpass, which was the right call, the variant she'd have chosen if asked. She'd tracked the first 3 turns with the internal compass she'd developed from years of navigating unfamiliar city neighborhoods at odd hours, and all 3 matched the revised plan Declan had outlined to her before boarding. The 4th turn didn't. She didn't say anything immediately. The response from Declan came back in 6 words. "We're not going near 41. Torres looked at her. Eliza looked at the partition. "Keen," she said. "Where are we going?" No answer. Torres was already moving, already reaching for the partition, already saying Keen's name with a sharpness that had replaced the confusion in his voice, and the vehicle slowed. Not a normal traffic deceleration, the wrong rate, too gradual. And Eliza reached across without a word and put both her hands on Vivian's shoulders and pushed the old woman down toward the floor of the vehicle, as low as she could get her, her body bent over Vivian's, her face pressed against the silver hair that smelled like lavender, and something older, something underneath the lavender, and she heard Vivian say what is happening, and she said "stay down" in a voice she barely recognized as her own. The radio crackled. Declan's voice came through, urgent and stripped to core words. "Lead vehicle. Convoy halt. All stop." And then the vehicle stopped. Not a traffic stop. A dead stop. The kind that came from a decision rather than traffic, in the middle of a street that Eliza could now see, through the window above Vivian's head, was completely empty of other cars in both directions. Completely, deliberately, impossibly empty. Her body understood before her mind had finished the sentence. Torres had the partition open and his weapon out. Keen was turned into the driver's seat, and his face was wrong, the specific wrongness of a person who had calculated something, and was now living in the 2 seconds before the outcome arrived. And Torres was saying something in a voice that had gone hard and flat, and Vivian's hand had found Eliza's wrist and was gripping it with a strength that was startling from a woman her age. The radio was still going, Declan's voice. Other voices on top of it. The lead vehicle, the trail vehicle, positions and commands bleeding into each other. And from 2 blocks away, maybe 3, the distance was hard to judge from inside a vehicle, came the sound that ended any remaining doubt about whether Eliza Rowan had been right. A concussive crack, low and heavy, the kind that didn't echo so much as absorb into everything around it, and then another, and then the unmistakable rapid percussion of automatic fire that she'd only ever heard before on a television screen, but that her body seemed to recognize anyway, at some cellular level, some deep instinctive register that existed before language. The ambush had started, and they were sitting in the middle of a cleared street in an armored vehicle with a driver who had brought them here on purpose, 2 blocks from the sound of it. Vivian's grip on her wrist tightened, and Eliza thought, with a clarity that felt almost hallucinatory in its sharpness, that she was going to have to make a decision in approximately the next 20 seconds that she could not take back. There was no version of this where she was the right person for what came next. She was a caregiver. She was 37 years old. She had a brother in a rehabilitation center and a studio apartment with a broken exhaust fan and 11 years of experience, keeping elderly people safe in environments that were supposed to be controlled. And this empty street, this turned driver, this radio full of gunfire, was the opposite of controlled. She was also the only person in this vehicle whose hands were free, whose position was correct, and whose body was currently between Vivian Viscari and the man in the front seat who had just delivered them to a place they were never supposed to be. She looked at Torres. He was dealing with Keen, both hands occupied. She looked at the door. She looked at Vivian, whose eyes were open and sharp and frightened in the way of someone who had lived long enough in this world to know exactly what frightened meant and not pretend otherwise. And Eliza Rowan, who had spent 37 years surviving things she wasn't supposed to survive, made the only decision that made sense. She moved. She hit the door release with her left hand and pulled Vivian with her right, and they went out of the vehicle onto the street in a way that was nothing like graceful, Vivian's knee caught the doorframe. Eliza's shoulder hit the asphalt first and absorbed it, and they were both down on the ground in the gap between the armored vehicle and the curb, with the cold October pavement pressing against Eliza's cheek and Vivian's breathing loud and ragged in her ear. Behind them, inside the vehicle, she heard Torres's voice go very sharp, a single word, and then the sound of something physical and fast that she didn't look back to process. She got her knees under her, got Vivian's arm over her shoulders. The old woman was heavier than she looked, the dead weight of someone whose body was frightened and not cooperating with what her mind was telling it, and Eliza's shoulder, the one that had hit the pavement, sent a flare of pain up through her neck that she noted and then simply did not have time for. "With me?" she said into Vivian's ear. "Right now. Can you move?" "Yes." Vivian's voice was thin, but it was there. "Yes, I can move." They moved. The street was a commercial block that had gone quiet. A row of narrow storefronts, most of them shuttered, the kind of block that sat between two more active ones and carried none of their foot traffic. Eliza got them to the nearest doorway, a recessed entrance to what looked like a closed alterations shop, and pressed Vivian against the metal security gate and put herself between the old woman and the open street. The gunfire she'd heard 2 blocks away had changed in character. Less sustained now, more intermittent. She didn't know what that meant, and she had no way of knowing, and the not knowing was a physical sensation, a pressure behind her sternum that she'd never felt before in quite this specific flavor. Her phone was in her bag. Her bag was in the vehicle. She looked at Vivian. The old woman's face was white-gray beneath the burgundy of her cardigan, her lips pressed together, her eyes, sharp, still sharp, thank God, moving between Eliza's face and the street beyond. "Give me your phone," Eliza said. Vivian reached into the pocket of her cardigan with a hand that was shaking in small, irregular intervals, the tremor of adrenaline rather than her usual condition, and produced a slim phone. Eliza took it, dialed Declan's number from the card she'd committed to memory 3 weeks ago, because she committed emergency numbers to memory as a matter of professional habit, and put it to her ear. It rang twice, 3 times. Declan picked up on the 4th ring, and before he could speak, she said, "East side of the block, recessed doorway, alteration shop. We're out of the vehicle. Vivian is ambulatory. Keene ran the wrong route." A half-second of silence. "I know about Keene. Are you injured?" "Vivian's knee. Minor. I took a shoulder on the pavement. Functional. Stay exactly where you are. Don't move unless someone's on top of you." His voice had the specific quality of someone managing 6 things at the same time and succeeding at all of them through sheer compression of attention. 4 minutes. "Copy." She hung up. Vivian was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on the old woman's face before. Not quite fear, not quite something else. A composite of things that hadn't had time to sort themselves into separate emotions yet. "You memorized his number," Vivian said. "I memorize relevant numbers." "How long ago did you memorize it?" "The 2nd week." Vivian made a sound that was somewhere between a short laugh and a breath of disbelief, and she put the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, and Eliza recognized that gesture. It was the gesture of a person holding themselves together by conscious effort, the physical equivalent of pressing both hands against a wound. "We're going to be fine," Eliza said, because it was what she believed, and because believing it mattered. "I know," Vivian said, and then, quietly, "He's going to blame himself." Eliza didn't ask who, she knew who. Declan arrived in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She'd been counting, 2 vehicles, 4 men, Declan himself out of the lead car before it had fully stopped, moving across the street with his weapon up, and his eyes doing the kind of continuous sweep that looked automatic, built in, like breathing. He reached their doorway and looked at Vivian first, a fast assessment, head to toe, checking the things that mattered, and then at Eliza, and something crossed his face that she didn't have a category for yet. "Vehicle's secure," he said. "Keene is in custody." A pause that held weight. "You want to tell me how you knew?" "The turn," Eliza said. "He took the Route 41 approach, the one from Harrow's document." Declan was quiet for a half-second. "Harrow gave him the route. We didn't get to that in the interview before Keene moved the vehicle." "They were working together." "Yes." Another pause, tighter this time. "There's a third." Eliza went still. "We've got Harrow and Keene," Declan said. "There's a third person who coordinated the street clearing. The block you're on. The businesses were given noise complaints yesterday. All of them closed this morning. Someone in the city system pulled the permits." He looked at her directly. "Whoever planned this has reach, inside the organization and outside it." Vivian, who had been listening without appearing to listen, said, "How many on their end?" "6 confirmed on the ambush team. 2 of mine are down." A fractional pause, the kind that acknowledged weight without stopping to carry it. "Not fatally, but down." Vivian closed her eyes for 1 second. 1. Then opened them. "Take us back," she said. Quote. Adrian Viscari was in the estate driveway when they pulled in, and this was the first time Eliza had seen him outside the controlled architecture of his own interior spaces. He looked different outside, not smaller, not larger, but more exposed in a way that was difficult to articulate, like a man whose environment usually reinforced his command, and who was now standing in open air with nothing reinforcing anything. He was at Vivian's door before the vehicle stopped moving. He got his mother out with his hands on her face first, checking her the way Eliza had checked her 20 minutes ago. And Vivian said, "I'm all right, Adrian," stop in a voice that was slightly hoarse and completely firm, and he held her face in his hands for another second regardless. And then he straightened and looked at Eliza. She was getting out of the other side of the vehicle. Her shoulder ached in a way that had progressed from functional to emphatic over the course of the drive back, and she was aware of the state of her jacket, which had met the pavement at speed and looked like it. She straightened up and met his eyes across the roof of the vehicle. She had expected anger. He was a man who processed fear as anger. She'd recognized that pattern early and filed it. She expected it to come at her now, the redirect, the displacement. What she got instead was something she wasn't prepared for at all. "Are you hurt?" he said. Not a bark. Not an accusation, just the question, stripped down to its bare mechanics. "Shoulder," she said. "I'll have it looked at." He nodded once, a short, precise motion, and then he turned back to his mother, and Eliza stood beside the vehicle for a moment in the raw October air and felt something shift in the internal arrangement of her assessment of Adrian Viscari, small but definite, like a single tile moved in a mosaic. Not enough to change the image, but enough to know the image was not entirely what she'd thought. The next 4 hours were the hardest kind of waiting. Not empty waiting, but the dense, populated kind where things were happening in rooms she wasn't in. Decisions being made by people who didn't owe her information, and her role was to stay in Vivian's room and monitor vitals and be the still point in the middle of whatever the rest of the house was doing. Vivian's blood pressure had spiked in the aftermath and taken 2 hours to come down to a level that Eliza would accept without calling Dr. Farrow. She'd administered the appropriate medications, kept the room quiet, managed the 2 security checks that Declan sent in the form of different men at different hours without letting them disrupt Vivian's rest more than necessary. The old woman had fallen asleep around 3 in the afternoon, the heavy sleep of an exhausted body that had used every available resource and was now collecting on the debt. Eliza sat in the chair beside the bed and listened to Vivian's breathing and let herself, just for a few minutes, be a person sitting in a chair who was tired. She was very tired. She was also starting to understand that the convoy incident was not going to resolve cleanly. 2 inside men. A third external contact. A network capable of clearing a city block through official channels. This wasn't opportunistic criminality. This was an organization that had spent time on this particular problem, had identified the target, the method, the internal access points, and had then deployed all of it in a coordinated sequence. The Calder Syndicate, she knew the name only from fragments of overheard conversation and the kind of general awareness that came from working in a household where certain names moved through the air like weather. She knew they were Adrian's primary opposition. She knew the tension had been building. She didn't know until today that Vivian was the pressure point. She was thinking about that, about why Vivian specifically, why not Adrian directly, what that choice revealed about the Calder organization's understanding of Adrian Viscari's vulnerabilities. When the door opened and Adrian walked in without knocking, she looked at him. He looked at his mother asleep in the bed, and something in his face did the particular thing it always did when he looked at Vivian, the thing she'd identified weeks ago and filed under the one thing he can't afford to lose. He pulled the other chair close and sat in it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "The third contact," she said quietly, so as not to disturb Vivian. Declan said someone with access to city systems. We're working on it. Do you have a direction? He looked at her, and she saw him decide something. A small internal negotiation, visible only in the fractional pause and the way his jaw set before he answered. The permits were pulled through a city planning office, he said. The office has 4 staff members. One of them has a brother-in-law who worked for Calder's import operation 3 years ago. A pause. That's not confirmation, that's a thread. Threads matter. They do. He looked at his mother again. She told me what you did, getting her out of the vehicle. Eliza didn't answer. She said you went out first, took the pavement. It made sense spatially. It made sense spatially, he repeated, and she couldn't entirely read the tone. There was something in it that might have been, in a different man, close to disbelief. You're a caregiver. Yes. You're not trained for… No, she agreed. I'm not. She looked at him directly, the way she'd learned to look at people who expected her to glance away. I didn't need training for it. I needed to move and I moved. That's the whole thing. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was going towards gray, the room dimming around the edges, and in the chair he looked, not like the man who had pointed at her in the dining room 4 weeks ago and called her whatever this is. He looked tired. He looked like a person who was carrying something that had gotten incrementally heavier over a long time and who had not yet found a place to set it down. I looked at your file, he said. Eliza's hands, folded in her lap, didn't move. I know. Vivienne told me she asked Colton. I looked at it separately, without my mother's request. He let that sit for a moment. You were enrolled in a nursing program at Mercy College. You withdrew in 2011. Yes. Your mother died that year. Yes. And you've been paying for your brother's treatment at Clearwater. He said it without inflection, without the softening that people sometimes applied to difficult facts, as if that changed what the facts were. For 8 months, the full residential rate. Where's this going? Eliza said. She kept her voice even, but the evenness cost her something. She could feel the cost of it in the back of her throat. I'm trying to understand you, Adrian said. You showed up in my house as someone I dismissed, and in 4 weeks you've identified a leak in my security operation, prevented a convoy ambush, and put your body between my mother and an open street. I'm trying to… He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and held them there for a moment. I owe you an apology for what I said when you arrived. That was… Another stop. Wrong. It was wrong. It landed differently than she'd expected. She'd imagined, on the rare occasion she'd imagined it, that an apology from Adrian Viscari would feel like a concession, a small tactical retreat from an opponent. Instead, it felt more like something he'd pried out of himself with significant effort and placed on the table between them, unpolished, and was leaving there. All right, she said. All right? I hear you. She looked at her hands. I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter. It did, but I hear you. He nodded. It was the kind of nod that closed something. Then he said, Debt at Clearwater. What's the current balance? She looked up. That's not your concern. I'm making it my concern. Mr. Viscari, Adrian. The correction was quiet, and it stopped her for a half-second in a way she hadn't anticipated, because for 4 weeks he'd existed in her internal taxonomy as Mr. Viscari, a category that included the dismissal and the pointing finger and the careful professional distance she'd maintained from the thing he represented. And Adrian was a different word, a shorter one, and it arrived without warning. Adrian, she said carefully, my brother's financial situation is mine to manage. It's $36,000, he said. She stared at him. How do you know the exact number? I told you. I looked at your file. My file doesn't have Mason's balance. A pause. Measured. I looked at more than one file. The implication of that settled over her with a cold precision, and she understood what it meant. That he had looked, that he had access to things she hadn't consented to give him access to, and that she should probably be angry about it. And she was, somewhere underneath the other things. But the $36,000 number was also just sitting there in the space between them, like a stone she'd been carrying so long it had changed the shape of her hands. I don't want your money, she said. I know that. He said it simply, without offense. I'm not offering it as a transaction. I'm not asking for anything. He looked at his mother again, at the slow rise and fall of Vivian's breathing in the dim room. She likes you. She trusts you. That's not something she does easily, and it's not something I take lightly. He paused. Let me do this. The silence lasted long enough for Eliza to have the entire internal argument with herself. The one about pride, about what it meant to accept something from a person in his position, about the line between help and obligation, about Mason, always about Mason, about 8 months of progress and $36,000 that she paid down at $400 a month, which meant she was 9 years away from zero if nothing else went wrong, and something always went wrong. The balance only, she said, nothing else. The balance. Nothing else. He held her gaze. Gaze, you have my word. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure she should, and she believed him anyway, which told her something about where things had shifted in the last 4 hours. And she wasn't sure yet whether that shift was a good thing or a dangerous one. All right, she said. Well, the thread Declan had found led somewhere none of them expected. It took 9 days to pull it fully. Eliza knew this because she counted the days the way she counted everything, with the precise attention of someone who understands that time is the resource you cannot recover once you've spent it. During those 9 days, the estate operated on a reduced contact protocol. Fewer visitors. Changed staff rotations. Declan's team audited every person who had passed through the property in the last 6 months. Eliza maintained her schedule. She was there every day, 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., and she watched the household tighten around its wounds the way any organism did, withdrawing, hardening at the edges, redirecting resources inward. She also noticed that Adrian Viscari was in his mother's wing more than he had been before. Not in a way that interfered with Eliza's work. He seemed to understand, instinctively or by observation, the rhythms of Vivian's care, and he didn't disturb them. He was simply present more often. Reading in the adjacent sitting room, talking to his mother in the evenings, the low cadence of their conversation coming through the partially open door, while Eliza completed her end-of-day charting in the corridor. On the 7th day, Declan came to Eliza directly. She was in the staff room, eating lunch, and he came in without preamble and sat across from her with the expression of a man delivering information he was still processing himself. The third contact, he said. It's not the city planning employee. Eliza put down her fork. Who? Marcus Venn. He watched her face. Does that name mean anything to you? No. He's been Adrian's financial attorney for 11 years. Handled the estate restructuring after the father died. Full access to asset maps, convoy schedules, property logistics. Declan's jaw was very tight. He gave Calder the layout of the entire security operation. Not just today's route, everything. 6 months of intelligence. The scale of it hit her in stages. Not a single leak. A sustained, deliberate, comprehensive exposure of everything the Vescari organization had built to protect itself. A man who'd been trusted for 11 years, sitting inside the architecture of that trust, and quietly dismantling it from within. Why? She said. Calder has his daughter. A pause. She was taken 14 months ago. He's been compliant since month 2. The anger that moved through Eliza was not clean. It was the complicated kind, the variety that didn't know which direction to go because the facts kept shifting what it was directed at. Venn was a man who'd been broken by leverage. He was also a man whose compliance had put Vivian in a cleared street with an ambush team and a corrupt driver. Does Adrian know? She said. He knows as of this morning. How is he? Declan looked at her steadily. How do you think? She thought about it. About what it meant to discover that the person who knew the most about how you protected the people you loved had been selling that knowledge for over a year. He's not angry, she said slowly. Not primarily. She stopped. He feels like he failed her, like the system he built to keep her safe was the thing that put her in danger. Declan was quiet for a moment. You read people very fast. I've had a lot of practice with people who are carrying more than they show. He nodded once and stood up. He's going to move against Calder. The timetable is moving up. I'm telling you because you need to know the security posture here is going to change. He paused at the door. I'm also telling you because the last time you had information, you used it right. After he left, she sat for a moment with the remains of her lunch and the information she'd been given and the particular heaviness that came from understanding a situation more completely than you had before and finding it worse than you'd imagined. Ven's daughter, 14 months. A man crushed between the daughter he loved and the people he served and the only option available to him, which was slow, systematic betrayal of the latter to preserve the former. She understood that math. She understood it in her hands and her bones, and the particular way her breath caught when she thought about Mason, about what she would do if someone held Mason at the end of a choice like that. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed on the table. It was a notification from Clearwater's billing portal. She opened it out of reflex, the reflex of a woman who checked that particular notification the way other people check the weather, automatically, bracing for whatever it said. The balance field read 0. She stared at it. She stared at it long enough that the screen dimmed. He'd done it already. Not in 9 days or 9 weeks. Overnight. She'd said all right 2 evenings ago, and she'd woken up this morning with a balance she'd been carrying for 8 months, resolved as if it had never been there. And she hadn't had time yet to feel all the things she was going to feel about that, because Declan had walked in with information about Marcus Venn, and the world had reorganized itself around a new and more immediate problem. She put the phone face down on the table. She pressed her hands flat on the surface. She breathed. The thing about being helped, really helped, in a way that actually moved the weight, was that it changed your internal landscape in ways you hadn't anticipated and weren't entirely ready for. She'd spent so long in the posture of managing alone that the sudden absence of one specific load didn't feel like relief. It felt like vertigo, like a rearrangement she'd have to learn to stand inside. She would figure that out later. There was a more immediate thing to stand inside right now. The second attack came on a Thursday, 12 days after the first. She knew something was wrong before she could name the knowing. It was early, 7 a.m. She'd come in an hour early because Vivian had a medication adjustment that needed morning monitoring, and the estate felt different in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. Too quiet in the wrong places. The guard rotation that usually had 2 men at the east corridor had 1. She was in Vivian's room, taking the morning blood pressure reading, when she heard the multiple vehicles. Coming fast from the north approach, which was not a delivery entrance and not a visitor entrance, and the sound was wrong. Too many, too fast. No deceleration pattern that suggested arrival rather than approach. She looked at Vivian. Vivian was already looking at her. Again? The old woman said, and there was something in her voice that was beyond fear, into the territory of a person who is discovering that the same nightmare comes back. Eliza had Vivian's arm over her shoulders and was moving before the first sound of impact reached them through the walls. The front gate, she thought. The collision report of something heavy against something that was designed to stop it, but wasn't designed to stop everything. She got them into the interior corridor, away from the exterior walls, and she was calculating exits, distances, the layout she'd memorized not as a security professional, but as a woman who always knew where the doors were, when Adrian appeared at the end of the corridor. He was in a jacket, no tie, his face doing the thing it did when he'd already made every calculation available to him and was running on the outputs. Behind him were 2 of Declan's men. He looked at his mother. He looked at Eliza. "There's a safe room," he said. "East basement. Can she walk that far?" Yes, Eliza and Vivian said simultaneously. Something moved across his face, not a smile, but the ghost of one, brief and involuntary. "Then we move now," he said. They moved. The corridor was long and they moved along it fast. Adrian ahead with one of the security men, Eliza and Vivian behind with the second, and Eliza could hear, from somewhere in the house, from multiple somewheres now, the sounds that told her the perimeter had been breached. Not just probing, not a single vehicle at a gate. Something broader, something that had planned for the reinforced entrance and brought enough to get through it anyway. Calder hadn't sent a warning shot this time. They were at the east stairwell door when the power went out. Full cutover. Not a flicker, not a partial failure, but the complete and instantaneous removal of light. The kind that only came from a deliberate cut at the source. The emergency lighting engaged 3 seconds later, amber and thin, casting the corridor in the particular flat illumination that made everything look both sharper and less real. Vivian stumbled. Eliza caught her. Full catch, her arms around the older woman's torso, taking the weight against her injured shoulder, which responded with a flare of pain that she compressed into a single sharp breath and discarded. "I have her," she said to Adrian, who had turned at the stumble and whose face in the amber light was something she didn't have time to fully read. Basement 60 feet, the security man, not Torres, a different one, Garza, said. Stairwell on the left. They moved again. The safe room was not large and it was not comfortable, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Reinforced walls, a separate air system, a communications panel that Garza had lived within 40 seconds of the door closing behind them. Vivian sat on the bench along the wall, and Eliza crouched in front of her and did the fastest possible physical check. Hands, face, breathing, the knee from the first convoy, the way her color was reading in the amber emergency light, and said, "You're all right. You're all right." "I know," Vivian said, and gripped Eliza's wrist again, the same grip from the street 2 weeks ago. "Are you?" Eliza looked at the hand around her wrist, at the knuckles, pale with pressure. "Yes," she said. Adrian was at the communications panel with Garza, talking to Declan on the exterior, and she could hear in the flattened compression of his voice the thing he was not showing on his face, the controlled fury of a man who has reinforced every wall and changed every variable and still found the enemy inside the perimeter, and who is now standing in a basement room with his mother and a caregiver while his people absorb the impact of something he failed to stop. She stood up and moved to stand near him because there was nothing else she could do that mattered right now, and proximity felt important, though she couldn't have said why. He glanced at her, brief, then back to the panel. Declan says 6 entry points, Garza reported. They came in coordinated. Eastern fence, north gate, and he stopped. Something in his earpiece. And the staff entrance. Someone unlocked the staff entrance from the inside. The room went very still. Eliza's mind moved fast, involuntary, through every person she'd seen at the staff entrance in 12 days. The rotations, the faces, the names she knew, and the names she'd only heard once. The moment she'd signed in at 7 a.m. and the guard, Petrick, the overnight guard, the one she'd nodded to every morning for 4 weeks, had not been at his station. She'd noted it and filed it and moved on because there were a dozen explanations, and she wasn't security, and it wasn't her department, Petrick. She said his name out loud without fully intending to. Adrian turned to look at her fully for the first time since they'd entered the room. "The overnight guard," she said. "He wasn't at the staff entrance this morning when I came in. I logged in at 7, the door was unlocked, and Petrick wasn't there." She held his gaze. "I should have flagged it. I noted it, and I moved on because I was focused on the medication adjustment, and I—" She stopped. The weight of that single deferred decision was sitting on her sternum with a specificity she had not expected. "I should have flagged it." Adrian stared at her. "You're not security," he said, and his voice was not what she'd expected. Not accusatory, not the redirect she'd anticipated. Just a statement of fact, stripped clean, the same tone he'd used when he asked if she was hurt. "I know what I saw," she said. "I should have said something." "You also identified Harrow. You also pulled my mother out of a vehicle on a cleared street." He held her gaze with an intensity that was not comfortable to absorb directly, but that she held anyway. "You're one person. You can't catch everything." She looked at Vivian. Vivian was watching both of them with the expression of someone watching something they've been waiting to see. The communications panel crackled. Declan's voice came through with the clipped efficiency of a man who was operational and didn't have time for anything else. "We have them contained on the north side. 2 down on their end. 1 of mine. Soriano, it's bad, but he's breathing. Safe room status. Occupied and secure," Garza said. 3 inside plus the principal. Hold position. 15 minutes. The 15 minutes were the longest kind. Vivian's blood pressure, which Eliza checked with the portable cuff she'd had the presence of mind to grab from the medical bag when they left the room, was higher than she wanted. She adjusted Vivian's position on the bench, got her to breathe at a rate she demonstrated with her own chest, and watched the numbers come down by increments that felt deliberately, infuriatingly slow. Adrian sat on the bench beside his mother. Not touching her exactly. There was a half-inch of space between their arms, but present in the way of someone who needed to be in contact with something real and was doing it without admitting it. She understood that too. When Declan gave the all-clear and the door opened and the amber light gave way to the returning overhead lights, they came up from the basement in a different order than they'd gone down. Garza first, then Adrian, then Eliza with Vivian. The same arrangement as the corridor, but something in the air between all of them had shifted, compacted, become something denser than it had been an hour ago. In the main hallway, Adrian stopped walking and turned to face Eliza, and she stopped too because his expression had the quality of someone who had arrived at a decision that was not comfortable and was going to say it anyway. "I want you to stay," he said. She looked at him. "I am staying. I'm contracted through, not the contract." He held her gaze. "Permanently. Full-time position. Not agency placement. My employ. Directly. Whatever Clearwater costs going forward, Mason's covered. You have a room here. Not staff quarters. A real room. A real situation." He paused. "This house is not safe. I know that. I'm not asking you to pretend it is." Another pause, and she saw in it the effort of a man who did not make himself vulnerable easily and was doing it now by deliberate choice. "I'm asking you to stay because my mother trusts you, and because I—" He stopped. The unfinished sentence sat between them, and she understood what was in the blank at the end of it, and she wasn't ready for what that meant. And she could see from his face that he knew she wasn't ready and was not going to press it. She was a caregiver from a studio apartment with a broken exhaust fan. He was the man who ran the most feared crime operation in the Midwest. The distance between those two facts was not small and was not theoretical, and she was aware of every inch of it. She was also aware of the way he had looked at her in the amber light of the basement when she said, "I should have flagged it." Not with blame, not with the dismissal she'd been braced for, but with something that looked uncomfortably and undeniably like the way a person looked at someone they could not afford to lose. She had recognized that look. She'd been wearing it herself for years, usually when she thought about Mason. "Let me think," she said. He nodded. The nod that closed something and opened something else simultaneously. She turned back to Vivian, and as she took the old woman's arm to walk her to the sitting room, she felt the weight of the decision she hadn't made yet sitting in her chest alongside the weight of the one she had. The unlogged absence, the unstated concern, the single deferred observation that had cost them a staff entrance and a guard, and the containment of an attack that was still, even now, not fully over. She was going to have to become something she'd never trained to be. Not because she'd chosen it, but because the choice had been made by proximity and circumstance, and the particular way a person who notices things gets drawn into the orbit of the things they notice. Vivian's hand tightened on her arm as they walked, and outside the estate's reinforced windows, the city pressed on, indifferent, enormous, lit against the October dark. And Eliza Rowan understood, with the quiet clarity of a woman who had survived by seeing things clearly, that whatever came next was going to ask of her something she wasn't sure she had left to give. She had always found it anyway. That was the thing about surviving. It didn't ask if you were ready. She gave him her answer the following morning. She'd spent the night in the staff quarters, the same narrow room she'd used on the 2 occasions when her shift had run past midnight and the transit back to her apartment wasn't practical. Lying on her back in the dark with the city's ambient light pressing through the curtain gap, and the weight of Adrian's unfinished sentence sitting in the room with her like a third presence. "I'm asking you to stay because my mother trusts you and because I—" She'd run the calculation the way she ran all calculations, methodically, without sentiment as the primary variable, holding each factor at arm's length long enough to look at it honestly. The estate was not safe. He'd said so himself, and that honesty was its own kind of data point. A man who told you the truth about danger rather than minimizing it to get what he wanted was a different category of man than she'd originally filed him under. The money was real, and its reality was not trivial. $36,000 zeroed overnight meant Mason's treatment was no longer a question of Eliza's continued physical endurance, and the permanence of that still hadn't fully metabolized. The room, the situation, the word dignity that Adrian had used in a sentence alongside her name, and that had landed somewhere she hadn't expected. And underneath all of it, the things she kept returning to in the hours between 2 and 4 a.m. when the calculations kept completing and she kept starting them again. Vivian, who had looked at her on their first day and seen something that didn't need to be explained, who gripped her wrist in the moments when everything went wrong, who said he hears things more than he shows and had been right about that, as it turned out, with a precision that Eliza found she should have expected. She knocked on Adrian's study door at 7:45. He was already at his desk, which did not surprise her. She had the sense, from everything she'd observed, that he slept the way men in his position often slept. In increments, badly, with one register of attention always running on maintenance. He looked up when she came in, and he did not say anything, which she appreciated. "I'll stay," she said, "under 2 conditions." Name them. Mason's treatment is covered as long as he needs it, not just the current balance. Forward, whatever comes next. I'm not negotiating that one. Done. And I want to know when something is coming. She held his gaze. Not the operational details, not the specifics of whatever you're doing about Calder, but if there's a credible threat to this house or to Vivian, I need to know before it arrives. Not in the middle of it, before. She paused. I can't protect her if I'm always reacting. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she was starting to learn. The particular quality of his attention when he was encountering something that didn't fit the categories he'd built and was deciding what to do about it. Agreed, he said. She nodded, turned to leave. Eliza. She stopped, turned back halfway. Thank you, he said. It was not an elaborate thing. It was 2 words said by a man who didn't say them easily, which gave them their weight. She left without answering, because some things didn't need an answer so much as they needed to be received, and she'd received it. The next 6 days were the calm before something. She recognized the texture of it, the estate running at a level of controlled efficiency that was too precise to be normal, the way Declan's team moved through the property with a slightly heightened economy of motion, the conversations that stopped 2 beats earlier than usual when she entered a room. Not hostile, just contained. The household was coiling around something, pulling inward, and she understood without being told that whatever Adrian was planning for Calder was moving toward its execution point. She focused on Vivian. The second attack had cost the old woman more than the first, and the cost was the kind that didn't show on a blood pressure cuff. Vivian was sleeping longer in the mornings and tiring earlier in the evenings. And there was a quality to her stillness now that Eliza monitored with the particular attention she gave to things that didn't announce themselves as problems, but that she recognized from experience as precursors to them. She'd seen clients go this way before, not declining exactly, but dimming, the way a room dimmed when a shade was partially drawn. The body's response to sustained fear was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was just a gradual withdrawal of energy, as if the organism was quietly renegotiating its terms. She adjusted the schedule. More rest in the late morning. Shorter sessions with the physical exercises Dr. Farrow had prescribed. More time at the window in the early afternoon when the light was at its best. Talking or not talking, just being adjacent to each other in the way that Eliza had learned was sometimes the most effective form of care available. Not treatment, not intervention, just presence. Vivian talked more in those afternoon hours than she had before. About the estate, about its history. About Adrian's father, a man named Cosimo Viscari, who had built what Adrian now controlled from something smaller and more brutal, and who had died when Adrian was 31 and left his son with an empire that came with no instructions and considerable enemies. He wasn't a good man, Vivian said once, without particular rancor, looking out the window at the stripped October trees. Cosimo. He was capable of good things, which is different. He built this because he understood how power worked, and he was willing to do things to get it that other people weren't willing to do. A pause. Adrian is smarter than his father was. He's also harder in some ways and softer in others, and he will never admit to the softer parts because he thinks admitting them is the same as surrendering them. Is he right? Eliza asked. Vivian considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. I think he used to be right. I think that calculus is changing. She glanced at Eliza sideways, with the accuracy that Eliza had stopped being surprised by. He came into my room last night and sat with me for 2 hours without his phone. Eliza looked at the window. He's never done that before, Vivian said. Not since he was a boy. The third convoy was Adrian's idea, and it was not a convoy at all. He came to her on the 6th day and told her quietly that Dr. Farrow had confirmed Vivian needed the lakeside monitoring. The cardiac data from the 2nd week had shown a pattern that needed professional evaluation and equipment the estate didn't have. It could not be postponed further. I'm not using a convoy, he said. Single vehicle. No advance notice of timing. I'm driving. She looked at him. You. Me. He met her eyes steadily. 3 people know the plan. You, me, and Declan. Nobody else until we're in the vehicle. And if something happens, then something happens and we deal with it. He paused. I need you there. For her. She didn't point out that there were other caregivers, that Phyllis was competent, that the logical argument for minimizing occupants in a vehicle undertaking a clandestine medical transport was not at the caregiver. She didn't point it out because she knew why he was asking, and the reason was not purely logistical, and she had decided in the narrow room 3 nights ago that she was going to stop pretending she didn't understand things she clearly understood. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow, 5 a.m. Minimal staff awake. I'll be ready." The rain started at 4:30 a.m., the heavy November variety that came in off the lake and hit everything sideways. Eliza was in Vivian's room at 4:45, and the old woman was already awake, which meant she hadn't slept, which meant she knew something was happening and had spent the night with it, rather than telling Eliza, which was exactly the kind of stoic, infuriating self-management that Vivian Viscari had been practicing for 78 years. "I'm fine," Vivian said, before Eliza could speak. "Don't take my blood pressure. It's going to be high, and you'll make a face, and then I'll feel worse." "I'm taking it anyway," Eliza said. She took it. It was high. She made a controlled professional notation in the chart and did not make a face. "I can tell when you're not making a face on purpose," Vivian said. "It's almost the same face." "We leave in 12 minutes, Eliza said. Adrian met them in the east corridor with an umbrella that he held over Vivian's head without comment as they moved through the covered walkway to the garage, and Eliza watched him do it. The specific practicality of that gesture, the umbrella over his mother's gray hair in the pre-dawn dark, and felt the shift in her chest that had been occurring with increasing frequency around him, the one she kept not examining directly because examining it had consequences she was not yet prepared to manage. The vehicle was a dark gray sedan, unremarkable. Exactly the kind of thing that didn't exist in the Viscari fleet, which ran to armored SUVs and black-town cars, and which she suspected had been acquired for exactly that reason within the last 48 hours. Adrian drove. Eliza sat in the back with Vivian, the rain on the windows and the sound of the wipers and the city in the early dark, and nobody talking. The particular silence of 3 people who were all paying close attention to different things. She was watching the road. She was watching it the way she'd watched every route since the first convoy, with the full attention she'd learned to deploy. Not anxious attention, the kind that found threats everywhere and became its own problem, but the clear, specific variety, the kind that had a baseline and would notice deviations from it. For 22 minutes, there were no deviations. Then the sedan behind them appeared. Not from behind. From a side street, a merge that came slightly too fast and settled into a following distance that was slightly too consistent. Most drivers varied their following distance by increments, traffic, attention, habit. This one didn't vary. It held the same gap through 2 lane changes and a traffic light. She leaned forward. "Adrian." "I see it." His voice was even. Already clocked it, she realized, probably before she had. His eyes moved between the road ahead and the mirror above it with the flat efficiency of a man who had spent years developing exactly this kind of surveillance awareness. "How long?" she said. "Cross street on Aldine 3 minutes back." "1 vehicle." "So far." So far was the operative phrase, and both of them knew it. She sat back and put her hand over Vivian's, not gripping, just contact, and Vivian turned her palm upward and held on. "There'll be a second," Eliza said. "I know." "Where?" "Meridian, probably. If they're using the standard box formation." He stopped. In the mirror, the sedan had closed 10 feet of distance. "They're not waiting for Meridian." The collision was not at full speed. It was a controlled rear impact, the kind designed to disable rather than destroy, that hit the sedan hard enough to throw all 3 of them against their restraints and send the steering into a momentary vacancy that Adrian corrected with both hands in under a second, his teeth set, the car fishtailing on the wet road and then tracking back. "Everyone," he started. "We're here," Eliza said, which was not quite what he'd asked, but was the most complete answer she had. The second vehicle appeared from the right, a large SUV out of a service alley, blocking the lane ahead. Box formation, exactly as he'd predicted. The sedan behind them had closed to contact distance. Left side was a construction fence running the length of the block. Right side was the SUV, nowhere. She felt Vivian's grip tighten, and she squeezed back and looked at the window on her left, at the construction fence, at the gaps in it. And she saw the gap, The gap that a vehicle of this size could not fit through, but that two people moving fast could. There, she said. I see it. She can't run that distance. I know. His voice was completely controlled. She could see in the mirror that his face was controlled too. Everything compressed inward, running calculations she couldn't follow. There's a loading bay past the fence, 30 feet inside. If I can get to that gap, the fence is blocking it. Not if I go through the fence. She processed that. The construction fence was temporary panel fencing, standard site equipment, interlocked metal sections. A vehicle moving at sufficient speed would go through it. The sections would come down at sufficient speed. The variables she was calculating in the 3 seconds between that thought and his movement were Vivian's cardiac status, the impact force of a fence breach at low speed versus the impact force of what was about to happen if they stayed in the box formation, and the fact that Adrian was already turning the wheel. Brace, she said to Vivian, and pulled the old woman against her, tucking Vivian's head against her shoulder and putting her own back toward the impact side. And then the sedan hit the construction fence, and the fence came down, and the noise was enormous, and the sedan went through it and into the loading bay, and Adrian had them stopped in 11 feet. The silence lasted 1 second. Then the bay's exterior light came on, motion triggered, and Eliza saw the figure in the shadows at the far end of the bay and understood that they had driven themselves out of one box and into another. The man was not in Calder's standard configuration. He was alone, which was wrong, and he was positioned in a way that suggested he'd been waiting specifically here, which was worse. He was moving toward the vehicle with the particular unhurried stride of someone who had already accounted for the exits and found them satisfactory. Adrian was out of the driver's seat before she'd finished processing it, and the two men converged in the space between the sedan and the bay wall, and she lost the visual when she turned her full attention to Vivian. "Look at me," she said. Vivian's face was gray-white again, the same color as the convoy street, but her eyes were open and present. "Are you hurt?" "Anything. Chest, arm. Tell me." Vivian stopped, pressed her free hand to her sternum, not in the specific way of cardiac distress, but in the way of a woman whose heart had been running too fast for too long. "I'm all right. My chest is tight or sharp?" "Tight, just tight, not..." "Okay." Eliza was already reaching for the medication case, the emergency nitrate she'd had on her person since the second attack because she'd refused to be caught without it again. "This goes under your Stay still." Outside the vehicle, she could hear the sounds of what was happening between Adrian and the man in the bay, and she did not look because there was nothing she could do about what was happening out there, and there was something she could do about what was happening in here, and she had made her choice about which one was her job. She administered the medication. She kept her hand on Vivian's pulse. She counted. It was 40 seconds before the bay door opened and Adrian got back into the driver's seat. She didn't ask. She looked at him in the mirror and he met her eyes, and his face was the controlled blank of a man who had done something he was not going to describe right now, and there was a cut above his eyebrow that was bleeding in the slow, insistent way of face wounds. "She needs Lakeside," Eliza said. "Now. Her chest is tight. I've given nitrate." He didn't answer with words. He started the car. They reached Lakeside Medical in 9 minutes. She spent those 9 minutes monitoring Vivian's pulse and the color in her lips and the rate of her breathing, relaying data to Adrian in the flat, specific shorthand she'd developed from years of ambulance-adjacent situations, and he relayed it to the facility on his phone with one hand on the wheel and the other on the gear shift. And she found herself noticing, in the compressed and fractured way she noticed things during emergencies, that his voice was completely steady. The cardiac team was waiting at the bay entrance. 3 people, a gurney, the efficient choreography of a facility that had been told what was coming and had prepared. She helped Vivian out of the car. The old woman moved with the slow deliberateness of someone who was managing her body carefully, spending each movement with precision because she understood she had a limited budget right now. Eliza had her arm and didn't let go until the team was there and had her, and then she stepped back and let them work, because letting other professionals work when they were the right people for the moment was its own form of care. Vivian looked back once, at Eliza. Not at Adrian, not at the team, at Eliza. And what was in her face was not fear anymore. It was something older than fear, something that lived underneath it, and Eliza held that look for the 2 seconds it lasted before the doors closed, and pressed her hand flat against her sternum and breathed. Adrian was beside her. She hadn't heard him move. They were standing in the bay entrance with the rain coming in sideways off the roof edge and the sound of the medical team diminishing down the corridor, and neither of them said anything for what felt like a long time. She reached up and touched the cut above his eyebrow without deciding to. Just her fingertips, assessing. The cut was shallow, the bleeding was slowing, the surrounding tissue was not swelling in a way that suggested anything deeper than surface trauma. Professional assessment, clinical. She told herself that. He went very still when she touched him. The particular stillness of a person who was not accustomed to being touched with that variety of attention. Not sexual, not aggressive, not transactional, just careful. "It needs cleaning," she said. She dropped her hand. "Does it hurt?" "No." "That's what people say." "I know." A pause. "It hurts." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had seen building across the last 6 weeks and had been carefully not acknowledging. And in the rain and the fluorescent bay lighting with his mother somewhere down the corridor in the hands of a cardiac team, there was no architecture left to not acknowledge it inside. "Adrian," she said. "I know," he said. "I know. Not now." She nodded. Not now was honest, and she respected honest. They moved inside together, out of the rain, and she went to find a first aid kit, and he followed at a distance that was close enough to matter. Sad. The waiting room at Lakeside was the standard variety. Too bright, too quiet, chairs upholstered in the particular shade of teal that someone had decided was calming, and that had the opposite effect. Eliza had spent collective weeks of her life in rooms like this. She'd learned to make her mind go narrow in them, to run a single channel rather than the full bandwidth of worry. Adrian did not know how to do this. She watched him figure that out about himself across the first 40 minutes. The way he stood up and sat down and stood up again. The way he rotated between 3 different positions along the far wall, as if proximity to the corridor doors would change something. The way his hands moved when he thought no one was watching, opening and closing with a slow rhythm that was the physical expression of everything he was not saying. She crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest to where he'd settled, his back to the corner wall, and she said nothing. And after a few minutes, he sat down in the adjacent chair and also said nothing, and they remained that way for the better part of 2 hours. The Calder attack. The bay. She was turning it over, not the action of it, but the intelligence behind it. The route this morning had been known only to 3 people. Her, Adrian, Declan, and still they'd been followed from the estate. She turned that over and felt the edges of it. "Declan," she said quietly. Adrian's head turned toward her, sharp. "Not Declan," she said quickly, "but someone watching Declan's preparation. If they couldn't penetrate the inner ring again after Harrow and Keene, they'd watch the outer ring. Surveillance on who left the estate in the pre-dawn hours. They didn't know the plan. They followed the departure." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That means they had eyes on the perimeter all night. Probably for several nights. Watching for non-standard movements. Which means they knew something was coming. Not specifically, just that we were protecting her differently." "Yes." He pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth briefly, the gesture of a man processing something with his whole body. "Then Calder knows we know about Ven. They expected us to change protocols." A pause. "They prepared for the change." "They're patient," Eliza said. "They're more organized than I estimated." He said it flatly, without the pride or denial that she'd seen other men employ when confronted with an enemy's competence. Just the assessment, the same as hers. "I've been fighting them like they were opportunistic. They're not." "No." He looked at her directly. "How do you see things like this?" She thought about it, about the real answer, which was long and included her mother's death and Mason's addiction, and 13 years of navigating systems that were designed to make people in her position invisible. And the fact that invisible people noticed a great deal because noticing was the only defensive tool they had. "I grew up without a safety net," she said. "When you don't have one, you learn to see the ground." He held her gaze. The cut above his eyebrow had dried, the first aid she'd managed in the bay having been adequate to stop the bleeding if not to properly close it. In the too bright waiting room light, he looked like a man who was very tired and was not going to say so. "I'm going to end this," he said. Calder. I'm not going to wait for their third attempt. I know. It's not going to be clean. I know that too. You should. He stopped. Something moved through his expression, a conflict she could see and couldn't resolve for him. You shouldn't be inside this. What's coming? She looked at the corridor doors. I made a choice to stay. That choice was for her, for this. He gestured, a minimal motion that encompassed the room, the situation, the thing they were sitting inside. Not for what comes next. You can't draw that line that neatly, she said. You can't tell me the two things aren't connected. She looked at him. I'm not leaving Vivian while there's active threat to her. The way to remove that threat is for you to do what you're going to do. A pause. So, the words sat between them with more in it than she'd technically put there, and she watched him understand that, watched the understanding land in his face and change something there. The cardiac team physician came through the corridor doors at that moment, and both of them were on their feet before she'd taken 3 steps toward them, and the doctor's face had the particular composed quality of someone bearing information that was not the worst possible but was not uncomplicated either. Mrs. Vescari is stable, she said. The episode was stress-induced tachycardia, not a cardiac event per se. We want to keep her overnight for observation and a complete echo. She looked between them. Are you family? Yes, Adrian said without hesitation. Eliza said nothing, but she felt the word land in her chest, felt it resonate against something she hadn't known was waiting for it. The doctor led Adrian toward the room, and Eliza followed 2 steps behind, and she was almost at the door when her phone vibrated in her pocket. She stopped, pulled it out. It was Declan. A text message, 4 words and a location. Calder moved on Chicago. Tonight. She read it twice. Then she put the phone away and went into the room where Vivian was lying in a hospital bed with monitors attached, and her silver hair spread against the pillow, and the old woman's eyes opened when she heard the door, and she looked at Eliza first, same as always. You look like something happened, Vivian said. Something is about to, Eliza said. She crossed to the bed and took Vivian's hand and looked at Adrian across the bed's width, and she told him quietly what Declan had sent. And she watched his face move through the landscape of what that meant. The acceleration of his own timetable, the collapse of the distance between planning and execution, the fact that Calder had apparently decided to stop being patient and go to war fully and openly. He looked at his mother. He looked at Eliza. He looked like a man standing at the exact moment where every choice he'd ever made was about to culminate in something he could not walk back from, and he was not looking away from it. I have to go, he said to Vivian. The old woman's hand tightened in Eliza's. I know, Vivian said. Come back. He moved toward the door and stopped, his back to the room, and Eliza said quietly, from across the space between them, Adrian. He turned. She looked at him steadily. Come back, she said. And she meant it in the same way Vivian had meant it, and also in a different way that she did not elaborate on because the room was not the place, and the moment was not the time. And he knew what she meant. She could see that he knew, and that was enough. He left. She sat in the chair beside Vivian's bed and held the old woman's hand and listened to the monitors and the rain against the window and the city outside. And somewhere in that city, in the next hours, the thing that had been building since before she arrived at the Vescari estate was going to reach the end of its fuse, and she could do nothing about that part. She was good at the part she could do something about. She stayed. The monitors kept their rhythm in the half-dark room, and Vivian's breathing evened toward sleep, and Eliza Rowan sat straight in her chair and watched the door and waited for the sound of returning footsteps. And the night outside deepened into the particular dark that comes just before the thing you've been holding your breath for finally arrives. And she had been holding her breath for a very long time. The call came at 2:47 a.m. She was still in the chair beside Vivian's bed, her back straight, the way it always was when she was maintaining wakefulness by posture rather than alertness. And the phone in her pocket buzzed, and she had it out before the second vibration completed. Declan. Again. She stepped out of the room before she answered. What happened? She said. Adrian is down. His voice was the controlled flat of a man delivering information while simultaneously managing 6 other things. But underneath the control was something she hadn't heard from Declan before. A fractional roughness, the edge that appeared in professional voices when the thing that happened was the thing they'd been working to prevent. He's alive. Gunshot wounds. We don't have full count yet. They're working on him. Mercy General, Trauma Bay. The corridor outside Vivian's room was pale and quiet and too bright, and she stood in it with the phone against her ear and felt the information arrive in the way that information sometimes arrived. Not all at once, but in layers. The first layer being the facts, and the second layer being what the facts meant, and the third layer being the part of her that had been listening for returning footsteps for the last 4 hours. "How many?" she said. "They're saying 5 entry wounds. He was—" A pause, the kind that held something Declan was deciding whether to say. He went in after Luca called her personally. The operation was proceeding correctly, and he went in personally. That was not the plan. She pressed her back against the corridor wall. 5. She'd read enough clinical material in 11 years of adjacent medical work to know what 5 gunshot wounds meant for survival odds, what it meant for surgical complexity, what it meant for the hours immediately following. She knew the numbers. She did not find the numbers comforting. "Vivian doesn't know yet," she said. "No. I'll tell her." She said it without deliberating because deliberating would take time she didn't have. "Which entrance at Mercy General?" "Trauma Bay is on the south side. I'll have someone meet you." "All right." She paused. "Declan, is he going to make it?" The pause on his end was 3 seconds, which was too long to be reassuring and too short to be conclusive. "He's in surgery. That's what I know right now." She hung up and stood for another 2 seconds with her hand flat against the wall, and she allowed herself those 2 seconds to feel the full weight of what she was carrying, the entire compressed mass of the last 7 weeks, and the man who had walked out of a hospital room 4 hours ago and said, "Come back with his eyes, if not his mouth." 2 seconds. Then she pushed off the wall and went back into the room. Vivian was awake. She'd been awake, Eliza realized. The quality of her stillness was not the loose texture of sleep, but the rigid variety of someone lying carefully unmoving in the dark because they'd heard something they were waiting to have confirmed. "Tell me," Vivian said. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, which she had never done before, and she took the old woman's hand and she told her directly and without softening it into shapes that were less sharp, because Vivian had asked her once, in a different context, not to be diplomatic on her account, and she'd been honoring that ever since. Vivian did not make a sound when she heard it. She closed her eyes and kept them closed for a moment, and her hand in Eliza's gripped with the strength that still surprised her, and then she opened her eyes and they were wet, but her voice was steady. "We're going to him," she said. "The cardiac team, Eliza." The way she said the name stopped the argument before it could finish assembling. Eliza looked at the monitors, at the numbers, at the echo results from earlier that evening, which she'd reviewed with the attending and which were concerning but not critical. She ran the calculation. "I'm getting a wheelchair," she said. "You don't walk the distance, and if your chest does anything other than tight, you tell me immediately." "Yes," Vivian said. "I mean it. I know you mean it. I said yes." Mercy General at 3:15 a.m. was the particular organized chaos of a trauma facility on a night when multiple things had gone wrong in the same city at the same time. She navigated it the way she navigated every medical facility, with the specific authority of someone who knew how hospitals worked, which corridors to take, which personnel to approach, and with what phrasing. And the wheelchair was both logistically necessary and socially useful, because a small elderly woman in a hospital gown moved differently through a trauma bay waiting area than a man in a jacket. And the nurse who brought them to the private surgical waiting room did it with efficiency and without the interrogation that might have slowed them down. Declan was there already. And 2 of his men, and a person she didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s, dark suit, the bearing of someone who operated in the adjacent space to Adrian's world but not within it directly, whom Declan introduced simply as Torres Reyes and didn't elaborate further, and Eliza filed the name and left it. "Status," Eliza said. "Still in surgery, 2nd hour. They got 3 of the 5. The remaining 2 are the complications. Location: abdomen and shoulder. The shoulder's the cleaner problem. The abdominal—" He stopped. "They said it's manageable. That's their word." She sat beside Vivian and they waited. The waiting had a different texture than the waiting at Lakeside earlier that night, which felt like a previous era now, a geological age ago. This waiting was the kind that had weight in it, Not the productive weight of something building toward resolution, but the suspended weight of a situation that had been handed to other people and could not be recovered from the outside. Vivian held Eliza's hand in her lap and didn't say anything, and Eliza didn't say anything, and the room was the particular species of quiet that forms around the thing nobody wants to say out loud. At 4:20 a.m., Torres Reyes received a phone call, stepped outside, came back in, and said quietly to Declan, "Luca Calder is dead." Declan looked at her. "Adrian's team completed the operation," Torres Reyes said. "The syndicate's primary operation is dissolved. There will be cleanup, but the structure is gone." A pause. "Adrian took down Calder himself before the shooting, then 3 of Calder's men. There were supposed to be 2. She said it without assignment of blame, just the fact of it. The miscalculation that had turned a surgical operation into a 5-wound surgical table. Vivian's hand in Eliza's had gone very still. "He finished it," Vivian said. "Yes," Declan said. "Stubborn," she said, and her voice broke very slightly on the word. Just once, just at the end of it, and then she pressed her other hand over the one that held Eliza's and was still. The surgeon came out at 5:53 a.m. He was a compact man in his late 40s with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been operating for the better part of 3 hours on a case that had demanded complete attention, and he delivered his information with the measured efficiency of a professional who had done this enough times to know that the first thing people needed was the primary fact, and everything else could follow. "He's out of surgery. Both abdominal wounds are repaired. There was significant blood loss and will monitor for the next 48 hours, but the repair is solid. The shoulder is straightforward." He looked between Declan and Vivian and Eliza and made the assessment, the way doctors made assessments in these rooms, of who was carrying what. "He'll be in recovery for approximately 2 hours, then we'll move him to ICU for standard post-operative monitoring. Someone can see him briefly in recovery if there's..." "His mother," Eliza said. "She's his family, and she's a cardiac patient herself, and she's been waiting for 2.5 hours. The surgeon looked at Vivian. He saw what Eliza had seen on the first day. The woman beneath the patient, the woman who had been running on the edge of her physical reserves since the convoy, and who was currently running on something that was not physical in nature and that Eliza could not supplement with medication. 10 minutes, he said, and she stays in the wheelchair. Agreed, Eliza said. She didn't go in with Vivian. She waited outside the recovery room door, her back against the wall, and she listened to the hospital's ambient sounds. The PA system, the distant equipment, the rhythm of a place that ran continuously, regardless of what happened inside it. And she let herself, for the first time since the phone call at 2:47, be a person standing in a corridor who did not know what to do next. The feeling was unfamiliar. She'd been in motion for so long, not just tonight, not just the 7 weeks at the estate, but the 13 years before it, the continuous forward motion of a woman who couldn't afford to stop because stopping meant looking at the distance still left to go, that the absence of an immediate next action created a kind of vertigo. $36,000, zero. Mason, 8 months clean, in a facility that was now covered forward, sending her texts about whether she'd eaten real food. A room in a house that was not a staff room, that had a window with a different quality of light than her studio apartment, that she had not yet slept in because she'd been here instead, in a hospital corridor at 6 a.m., waiting. She was waiting for something that was not her professional responsibility. She was a caregiver. Her patient was inside the room in a wheelchair with 10 minutes to see her son. Her professional responsibility was the cardiac patient, and she was attending to that responsibility by being available outside the door. She let herself believe that for approximately 45 seconds before she acknowledged the other thing. The reason the floor felt slightly unsteady. The reason the word "come back" had lived in her chest since he'd walked out of Vivian's room hours ago. The reason she had said it back to him, in the way she'd said it, and had watched his face change. She was not a woman who fell easily. She'd learned early and maintained steadily that getting attached to things you couldn't afford to keep was a specific variety of damage, the slow burn kind that compounded. She'd kept herself careful. She'd kept herself at the right distance from things. She'd also spent 7 weeks in a house where a man who had dismissed her as nothing had learned to look at her the way he looked at the one thing he couldn't afford to lose, and she'd watched that happen in increments and had kept filing it as data until the data had gotten too substantial to file anymore. The recovery room door opened. Vivian came out in the wheelchair, and her face was different from the face she'd gone in with. Not lighter exactly, but differently arranged, something resolved in it that had been suspended. She looked up at Eliza. "He wants to see you," she said. Eliza looked at the door, then at Vivian. "You should get back to Lakeside. Your echo—" "Eliza." The old woman said it with the particular patience of someone who had stopped being willing to let other people prioritize everything except themselves. "Go see him. I will sit here with Declan for 10 minutes and not collapse, and then you will take me back. In that order." She held Vivian's gaze for a moment. Then she went through the door. The recovery room had the post-surgical quality that all recovery rooms had, the compressed air of a space where something difficult had recently been done and was now in the process of being survived. The monitoring equipment made its steady sounds. The lighting was dimmed, the kind of dim that was not restful so much as it was reduced to essentials. Adrian was in the bed with his eyes open, which surprised her. She'd expected the half-consciousness of recent anesthesia, the unfocused quality of someone still being retrieved from a deep place. He was conscious in a way that was clearly costing him, the effort of it visible in the set of his jaw and the deliberate rate of his breathing, and when she came through the door, his eyes found her immediately, and stayed. She crossed to the bedside and stood and looked at him, and she took his condition in with the professional register that was always running: color, rate, the lines attached to him, the readings on the monitor. And everything she saw said he was going to be all right, said the surgeon's assessment was accurate, said the next 48 hours were going to be hard, but the outcome was not in question. She let herself feel that for a moment. Let the relief of it be a physical thing that moved through her and settled. "You went in yourself," she said. "I know." His voice was rough from the tube, the standard rawness. "I know I did." "That wasn't the plan." "No." He held her gaze. "Calder had a secondary location. The intelligence said he'd be in the warehouse. He wasn't. He was in the building next to it. If I'd waited for the team to reposition—" He stopped, controlled his breath. "He would have been gone, and he'd have come back. So you went." "So I went." She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat down and looked at him from the new angle, the sitting angle, the one that was closer and less clinical. "5, she said. "I'm told." "Do you know how many 5 is?" Something in his face moved. Not quite a smile, the muscles not quite cooperating for that yet, but the intention of one. "I'm getting a fairly detailed education on the subject." She put her hand on the bed rail. Not on his hand, not yet. On the rail, a compromise between the distance she was used to maintaining and the thing she was not maintaining anymore. "Calder is done," he said. "I know, Torres Reyes told us." "Torres Reyes?" A slight pause. "You filed her. I file everyone." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "Eliza." "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say. You're going to say something about not wanting me in that world, about the life not being— And I'm going to tell you that I made my choice, and I made it with full information, and you negotiating it after the fact while you're in a hospital bed at 6 a.m. is not— I was going to say thank you," he said. She stopped. He held her gaze with the specific effort of a man working against pain and medication and post-surgical exhaustion to be completely present for something he'd decided was not going to wait. "For my mother, for the convoy, for the document you noticed, and the turn you noticed, and the fact that you memorized Declan's number in the second week because you thought it might matter." A pause. "For staying. You didn't have to stay. You made a choice to stay, and everything that's intact right now, she's intact. That's you." She looked at the monitor. She looked at his hand on the bed, the IV line running across the back of it. She looked at the wall. "You told me I was whatever this is," she said, "the first day." "I know." "You pointed at me." "I know." He said both things without flinching, without the retroactive softening that people applied to their own worst moments. Just the acknowledgement, flat and real. "I was wrong before I knew you. I was wrong in a way that was specifically about how I'd learned to see people, as threats or assets, and you didn't look like either, so I looked past you." A pause. "I don't know how to say this well. I'm better at other things than saying things well." "I've noticed," she said, "but I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her with an intensity that the medication and the exhaustion and the monitors and the distance between what he was and what she was could not fully diminish. You are the least whatever that is person I have ever met, and I don't know what to do with that except tell you. She sat with that for a moment, with the weight of it and the specific texture of being seen by someone who had originally chosen not to look. She picked up his hand. Carefully, with the professional awareness of the IV line and the monitoring leads, but she picked it up and held it, and she felt his fingers close around hers with the deliberateness of someone who understood exactly what they were holding. You need to sleep, she said. I know. I'm taking your mother back to Lakeside. She needs the overnight monitoring more than she did before tonight. Will you come back? She looked at him, the directness of the question, stripped of everything except what it was. Yes, she said. He nodded. His eyes, which had been holding themselves open with effort, were losing the fight, and she watched the medication and the body's exhaustion begin to win back the ground he'd spent on being present. Eliza, he said as his eyes closed. Still here, she said. She sat with him until his breathing evened and deepened, and then she set his hand down carefully on the blanket and stood and straightened and went back out to the corridor where Vivian was waiting with Declan's patients beside her, and she pushed the wheelchair toward the exit with her hands steady and her back straight and the city showing its first gray light through the hospital's glass doors. Mason called at 8 a.m. She was in the lakeside waiting room while Vivian slept through her delayed overnight monitoring, and she picked up on the first ring and said, I'm here. And he said, Are you okay? I've been trying to reach you since last night. And she said, I'm fine. And he said, That's what you always say. And she said, This time I mean it. A pause on his end. You don't sound fine, Liz. I'm tired, she said. I've been up all night. I'm okay. Another pause, the kind Mason did when he was making himself ask something he was afraid of the answer to. A habit she recognized from his first weeks at Clearwater, when everything still felt provisional, and he was always testing whether solid things would remain solid. The balance, he said. On the account. I got an alert and it said, I know. That's not your money. It's handled, Mason. Liz, it's handled and it's real, and you don't need to worry about it. She said it in the voice that had evolved over 13 years from something effortful into something she barely had to construct anymore. The voice that meant, I have this, let me have it, trust me to have it. But how are you feeling today? A longer pause this time. She heard him breathe, heard the quality of it. Steady, she thought, more steady than 6 months ago. 8 months of the particular work of reassembling a life. Better, he said. I've been better. There's a counseling certification program. Here at Clearwater, they have a graduate track. A pause that was different from the earlier ones, lighter, a little uncertain in the way of someone approaching something they want. I've been thinking about applying. She pressed the phone against her ear and closed her eyes briefly. Mason, 29 years old and talking about a graduate track in a voice that contained something she hadn't heard in it for a long time. Not obligation or shame or the thin wire of managed day at a time, something that pointed forward. Apply, she said. I think you should apply today. She opened her eyes. The waiting room light was the early flat kind, the November morning coming gray and calm through the windows. I think you've been figuring out how to be okay, and now you're figuring out what to do with being okay, and that's the right order. A pause. Apply today, Mason. He exhaled, long and slow. Okay, he said. Okay, yeah, I will. After she hung up, she sat for a moment with the phone in her lap and the waiting room around her and the sound of a hospital morning beginning its routines, and she felt something she had not felt in long enough that it took her a moment to identify. Not relief. Relief was the absence of dread. This was something with its own weight, a positive weight, the kind that came from a direction rather than from a clearing. She was 37 years old. She had a brother who was going to apply to a counseling program today. She had a room in a house with a window that had better light than her studio apartment, and a woman whose hand found hers in the worst moments, and a man in a recovery room who had said, "Will you come back?" in a voice that she was not going to finish forgetting. She had given up her nursing program when she was 24 because it was the only choice that made sense. She had carried that choice and everything that came with it for 13 years without putting it down. It occurred to her, sitting in the waiting room light, that some of what she'd been carrying had been set down recently without her fully noticing the moment of setting it down. Not erased. The years of it were still years. The things that had happened were still the things that had happened, but the weight of them had shifted, redistributed. She was not sure yet what she was carrying now, what new weight she was learning the shape of, but it was different from the old one. Different was not nothing. Vivienne was discharged the following afternoon. The echo showed what the cardiologist called stress-induced transient changes, reversible, manageable, with medication adjustment, and not indicative of permanent damage provided the stress in question did not recur at similar intensity. Vivienne received this information with the expression of a woman who had spent decades in the company of stress at intensities that would give a cardiologist a productive career's worth of material. "I'll take the medication," she said. "I can't promise the rest." "The rest is my job," Eliza said. The cardiologist looked at her, and she looked back with the straightforward clarity of a woman who was not being optimistic, and he nodded, apparently satisfied. They returned to the estate in a vehicle driven by Garza, 2 follow cars, the revised security configuration that Declan had implemented in the aftermath, and Vivienne sat in the back beside Eliza and watched the city go past the windows with the expression of a woman doing her own internal accounting. "Do you know," Vivienne said, somewhere around the 3rd traffic light, "that in 50 years of living in this family's world, I have never once had someone get me out of a car onto a pavement." "I did it badly," Eliza said. "Your knee, my knee is fine." Vivienne looked at her sideways. "I'm not criticizing. I'm saying I've had bodyguards and drivers and security details for 5 decades, and not one of them has ever actually put their body in front of mine." A pause. "You did it without thinking. It was the fastest option. You keep saying things like that because they're true." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think the difference is?" Eliza waited. "Those men were protecting their job," Vivienne said. "You were protecting me." She said it simply, the way she said things that she'd had time to examine and had decided were simply true. That's not a small difference. That's the whole difference. Eliza looked out the window at the city. At the November streets, the trees stripped and structural, the sky the flat white that preceded real winter. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am," she said. It was as close as she'd come, with anyone, to explaining the thing that had no clean explanation. The 11 years, the sacrificed program, the studio apartment, Mason, all of it, as a single sentence. Vivienne's hand found hers on the seat between them. "I know," the old woman said. "That's why I trust you with my life." Adrian came home on the 9th day. She knew he was coming. Declan had given her the timeline 2 days prior, and she didn't make anything of the knowing, didn't arrange herself differently, or prepare any particular statement. She was in Vivienne's sitting room, doing the afternoon medication, when she heard the main entrance, heard the particular quality of movement in the house that accompanied his arrivals. And she finished what she was doing and noted the time and the dosage and capped the pen before she looked up. He was in the doorway of the sitting room 3 minutes later. Thinner. 9 days had taken something from him in the visible way that trauma and surgery and recovery took things. The edges more defined, the face carrying the residue of sustained pain. He was moving carefully, the shoulder immobilized, the right side held with the conscious compensation of someone navigating discomfort they'd decided to stop complaining about. He looked at his mother first. He always looked at his mother first. Vivienne looked at her son across the sitting room with the expression she wore when she was taking inventory of something she'd been afraid of losing. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you," he said. "Sit down before you fall down." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from hers, and Eliza stood and gave him the assessment she couldn't stop herself from doing. Color adequate, gait compensated but functional, nothing in the visible signs that contradicted the discharge summary she'd read. And he looked at her while she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." "You didn't, actually." He considered this. "I heard you say it." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed, "but it meant the same thing." Vivienne made a small sound from her chair that was not quite a cough and not quite a comment. He looked at Eliza steadily. From the chair, with the particular quality of attention she'd been learning the weight of for 2 months. I have something to tell you. All right? Ven's daughter, he said. She's alive. She was being held in a Calder property in Indiana. When the operation concluded, the property was accessed. He paused. She's been returned to her father. Eliza absorbed this. Marcus Venn, 11-year attorney, the man who had given Calder 6 months of intelligence under the unbearable leverage of a daughter taken. The thread that Declan had pulled. The information that had rearranged her understanding of the whole architecture of what had been done to this family. He'll face consequences, she said. Venn. Yes. Adrian's voice was flat. Not from me. What he did had reasons. Reasons don't change consequences, but they change what kind they are. A pause. He'll cooperate with the federal review that's coming. He'll lose his license. He'll live with what he did. A pause. His daughter is alive. I don't know what that is to him, but she's alive. She thought about Venn sitting in the compressed reality of that choice for 14 months. The daughter in one hand, the betrayal in the other, no version of the equation that didn't cost everything. She thought about Mason, about the things she would have done, would do, if that were him. It's enough, she said quietly. Her being alive. That's enough. He looked at her in the way he looked at her when something she said landed somewhere he hadn't expected, and she saw him agree without saying so. Vivian, who had been watching both of them with the patience of a woman who had waited decades to see things she'd been hoping for, said, Eliza, show him the room. Eliza looked at her. The room we set up for you, Vivian said. He hasn't seen it. Show him. It was, Eliza understood perfectly well, the least subtle thing she'd ever witnessed Vivian Vescari do. She also understood that at 78, with a recent cardiac episode and a returned son and a cardiologist-approved reduction in her stress burden, Vivian had apparently decided she was done being subtle. She looked at Adrian. He was trying not to look like he was waiting. Come on, she said. The room was on the east side of the house, away from the primary residential wing, with a window that faced the garden. It was not large. It was larger than her studio apartment. The window had the light she'd noticed in her first week at the estate, the particular quality that the east-facing rooms got in the late morning, the honest light that didn't flatter so much as it simply showed things clearly. She had not yet brought anything from the studio apartment. The room had the estate's furnished quality, clean, adequately appointed, impersonal in the way of rooms that were waiting for a person to make them specific. Adrian stood in the doorway and looked at the room, and she stood inside it near the window, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The studio apartment, he said. You still have it. I paid through the end of the month. She looked at the window. I haven't decided. About the apartment. About everything it represents. He came into the room properly, moving carefully with the shoulder, and stood near her, close enough that she could see the cut above his eyebrow that had healed to a thin pink line since the hospital bay when she'd touched it with her fingertips and told herself it was clinical. What does it represent? He said. She looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at him since she'd stopped looking away, which had been the best decision she'd made after the worst decisions had already been made for her. Independence, she said. The fact that I built something that was mine, that whatever I have, I got there by my own terms, not someone else's. She paused. That matters to me. It will keep mattering to me. I know, he said, and he said it in the way of someone who had genuinely understood something, not in the way of someone managing an objection. I'm not asking you to give that up. I'm not asking you to be something different than what you are. He held her gaze. What I'm asking for is considerably simpler and considerably more complicated than that. What are you asking for? He looked at the window. At the garden beyond it, the November garden, the stripped trees, and the flat, cold light. I'm asking you to let this be yours, he said. This room, this house. Not mine that you're inside. Yours that you chose. A pause. I'm asking you to let me... He stopped in the same place he'd stopped 2 months ago, in the dining room corridor, when he'd said, and because I... And she'd carried the unfinished sentence in her chest since. Say it this time, she said. He looked at her. The man who was not good at saying things, who was better at other things, who had walked into a warehouse alone because the alternative was letting something survive that he hadn't been able to eliminate from a distance. I'm asking you to let me love you, he said. "In whatever way you can live with that. On whatever terms make it real instead of just a thing I want." The November light came through the window and fell on the floor between them, and she looked at this man who had pointed at her and called her whatever this is, and had then, across 7 weeks of crisis and convoy and a cleared street and 9 days in a hospital bed, arrived at the honest version of himself. Not softened, not reformed, not the villain who turned good, but the complicated person who had looked at her clearly and found himself changed by the looking. She was not a woman who made decisions from sentiment. She was a woman who looked at things clearly, who noticed what was real, who had spent 13 years seeing the ground because she couldn't afford not to. What she saw was this: a room with good light, a brother applying to a counseling program today, an old woman in a sitting room who gripped her wrist in the worst moments and said he hears things more than he shows, and a man standing near a window asking her, in the only way he knew how, not to be invisible anymore. She had been invisible for a long time. It had kept her safe. It had also kept her alone in the way that safety sometimes did, the quiet, comprehensive loneliness of a person whose existence ran on function and who had stopped asking for anything that didn't serve the function. She was 37 years old. She had been surviving for 37 years. Surviving was not nothing. Surviving was, in fact, everything. The bedrock, the reason Mason was alive and in a facility that was paid forward and applying to programs, the reason she could stand in this room right now. But she was tired of surviving being the whole of it. She reached up and touched the healed line above his eyebrow, the same way she'd touched it in the hospital bay, and this time she didn't tell herself anything clinical about it. He went still under her hand, the same stillness as before. "Your terms," she said. "I'll tell you when something isn't working. I won't disappear into this. I won't give up what I've built." "I know," he said, "and you tell me when something is coming. Every time. Non-negotiable." "Every time," he said. She lowered her hand, looked at him steadily, the way she looked at things she was deciding to be certain about. "All right," she said. He let out a breath that was longer than his usual breaths, the kind that had been held for longer than this conversation. Outside the window, the Chicago skyline ran its length against the November afternoon, building after building in the flat gray light. The enormous, indifferent city in which a quiet woman had spent 13 years being invisible because it was safer, and a man who ran the most feared organization in the Midwest had spent those same years learning that fear was not the same as strength. Vivian Vescari was in her sitting room right now, having her afternoon tea. Mason Rowan was at a desk in a rehabilitation center filling out a graduate program application. Marcus Venn was somewhere in the city with his daughter, returned to him, living inside the complicated arithmetic of what survival had cost him. Declan was coordinating the ongoing consolidation of a dissolved syndicate. A cut above Adrian's eyebrow had healed to a line that would eventually disappear. And Eliza Rowan was standing in a room with good light that was going to be hers, not because she'd sacrificed for it or survived into it, but because she'd looked at the ground for long enough to finally see what the ground was for. Not to catch you when you fell, but to stand on, deliberately, and choose your direction from. She turned back to the window. He stood beside her, not touching, just present, the particular presence she'd learned the specific weight of. The city ran on, enormous and lit and indifferent. And below it, in a room on the east side of an estate on the north side of Chicago, two people stood in the honest light of a November afternoon and looked at what was real. That was the whole of it. That was enough.